It's recording. You just go ahead and say
Okay, yeah. Hi, testing. All right. Here we go. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Let's try these two, pink and this. Let's see what the camera, there it is. All right. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about play, experimenting, and performing. Why do we do this? Why do we talk about this in the Honors College? Well, let me tell you. Part of our philosophy is really a methodology, an approach to learning and development. And it has to do with this. It's about creating learning developmental environments where people can stretch, grow, try new things by playing, improvising, performing. Okay? So it's about learning and development. Grounded in a whole tradition, several traditions of traditions in the academy, but also in the community, among philosophers, scientists, anthropologists, literary scholars, people in the community in terms of musicians, in terms of artists, in terms of people who are playing sports. People don't make this connection, but when you're playing in a team, it's an improvisation based on the ensemble, the team playing together, right? So when Magic Johnson passes something to his teammate, that teammate then takes the ball, he accepts the offer, and then does something with it. So that's the practice of yes-anding, which comes from theater. So multiple influences from the academy, from the community, and from history writ large. So let's get started. Let's take it back to William Shakespeare. What Shakespeare said was, all the world's a stage. Let's write this out. All the world a stage, right? Let's continue with this. All the world's a stage, and all the men and all the, let's call it people, all the people, right? We'll put it like this so that we know that those weren't the actual words he said. All the people, merely players, merely, I think there's an extra E somewhere there. Merely players. This comes from the comedy, As You Like It. The character is Jacques, who in Act 2, Scene 7, line 139 says this. So why do we begin with this? In some ways, it's to, if you will, set the stage with the idea that, let me erase some of this, with the idea that in some ways, all the spaces that we're in are performative spaces, right? In some ways, life, all of life is a stage in the sense that we learn different kinds of roles. We learn different ways of being in those roles. We're not static. We're ever changing, evolving, developing, and we can do it intentionally or not. So in the Honors College, we've adopted this basic premise that all the world's a stage. And we begin with Shakespeare because of the theater and because of Shakespeare, after all, right? But many people practice this. That is, when you're a human being, you are improvising on a stage. Now, we don't think of it in the sense that we do it as deliberately as we could, but that's what we're doing. When you go into a job interview, you're actually performing, usually, right? You say, well, good morning, and you put your hand out to shake their hand or whatever the appropriate thing is. So we learn how to perform differently in different contexts, and how we learn that is by copying or emulating others, creatively emulating others. So this, in some ways, is grounded in some of the work of a mid-19th century German philosopher historian named Karl Marx, who in the 18th Brumaire wrote that basically we are both the products and the producers of history, right? He said something along the lines of, men make their histories, but not entirely on their own conditions. And in some ways, this is the idea that we are both the products of history and our environment, but also the producers of those environments. He was somebody who influenced an early Russian psychologist / educator named Lev Vygotsky. So let me write out some of these names so that you have them. So the first person is, of course, William Shakespeare, right? We then talked about Karl Marx. And what does he say? He says, basically, that we are both the products and the producers of history. And then we talked about Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky. And what he introduces is this notion of the zone of proximal development, the ZPD. I'll just write it down because it's sort of a funny sounding thing. It sounds like it's very science fiction-y. But the idea is that people are creating, we're social creatures, and we create spaces where people can stretch and grow and learn new things. So the example that he gives is with language. How is it that people learn language? He posits that people learn language by basically having a language speaker, let's say an older sibling, speak to a younger sibling, a toddler, and that toddler babbles their way into language speaking by using some of the words and what he understands to be the words, or they understand to be the words of something, and the language speaker, the older sibling, basically relating to that younger person, the toddler, as somebody who can understand. So classically, let's just say, there's a bottle of water here. So the toddler might say, a bottle. And then the older sibling, you mean, do you want the bottle, Billy? Right? So in this interaction of the language learner becoming a language speaker, babbling, and the person who does speak the language better, let's just say, relating to the toddler as if they can learn, through that interplay, the toddler learns how to speak, right? Learns how to use language. So that insight is really important because it allows us to think about how we can use that throughout our lives, not just with children, not with toddlers, but with all people. How we can relate to people, to use Vygotsky's words, ahead, taller than they are, right? And this might remind some of you of the work of Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck, let's put her name here, Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck is an American psychologist whose idea of the growth mindset is very much in line with this, the growth mindset, which is that mindset, which is the idea that, like Vygotsky's saying, I think, you'd relate to people as if they are becoming something else, ahead of themselves, as opposed to relating to them doing something just wrong, right? Who wants to be around people who just constantly tell them wrong, wrong, wrong? You like to be with people, I think, I like to be with people who relate to me as if I'm becoming something else or as if I am that thing. And that allows me to step into those shoes and become those things, if you will. Not overnight, but as part of a process, an extended process. So we've talked about Shakespeare, we've talked about Marx, we've talked about Vygotsky, we've talked about Carol Dweck. Some other important people that are part of our groundings, intellectually and otherwise. Let's talk about Ludwig Wittgenstein. Ludwig Wittgenstein, a very tricky name for me to spell at least. Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein. Who was this? Who was Ludwig Wittgenstein? Or there was a play down at the Castillo Theater in New York many years ago, and they referred to him as Viggy. But Ludwig Wittgenstein was an Austro-British philosopher who lived in the mid-20th century, early to mid-20th century. And he talked about this idea of language games. He talks about language as an activity, not just simply language as representative of something else, like, you're using it to describe, like I pick this up and say, what is this? It's a pen, right? But I'm also using language to demonstrate something larger, right? So language as an activity, which is an interesting shift in thinking about things. It pushes back against what sometimes is called the epistemological bias. That is the idea that you have to understand everything by knowing exactly what it means and what it is before you can move on to the next thing. So we talked about a number of people. Another person I wanted to introduce is the work of a sociologist named Erwin Goffman. Who was Erwin Goffman? Erwin Goffman. He basically is along the lines of actually other people that would develop what's called performance studies, namely Richard Schechner and Victor Turner, who was an anthropologist, which is that all of the spaces that we're in are, if you will, socially constructed, socially made, that they're kind of like a stage. And so Erwin Goffman gives expression to this in some of his work. He talks about this in a piece called The Presentation of the Self. So we're talking about a lot of people here who have influenced the ideas that we use in the Honors College. Let's go back. William Shakespeare, Karl Marx, Lev Vygotsky, Carol Dweck, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Erwin Goffman, Richard Schechner, and Victor Turner. I think we talked about them. Let's move on now. Some of you have heard of code switching. This is something that's especially pertinent among African Americans in the tradition of what Du Bois talked about, double consciousness. W.E.B. Du Bois, famous historian and sociologist. And the idea that African Americans living in the United States have to deal with both their identity as Black people, but also having to navigate a dominant white society. And others have built on this and have talked about the importance of code switching. As one of my very dear colleagues, Professor Noble, talks about to both not just survive, but also thrive. So in different spaces, people have to make judgment calls as to how to perform, if you will, in order to survive and or succeed, thrive, right? So code switching is something that was made popular by somebody named Einar Haugen. Einar Haugen, yet another name, Einar Haugen. And so I think most people know that when you're in a social environment, you are going to speak in a certain way given the context, right? Like if you're in a room full of kindergarten kids, you might speak with them in one way. You might speak with them maybe with a higher tone voice, I don't know, to sound more non-threatening, maybe, I don't know. As a guy, I need to be aware of sort of my physicality walking into spaces sometimes. So maybe I'll speak with a slightly higher tone as opposed to the low tone like this. But maybe I might use that too. Language and body language are tools that we can use to connect with people, to help create environments. But if I'm talking to my elderly, a grandparent, I might speak more softly. I might speak a little bit more loudly, actually, in this case. But I might speak more slowly, I should say. So people move in different ways and speak in different ways, different contexts. But it doesn't mean that you're losing yourself, that it's no longer me. In some ways, it's just me performing in different ways given the context, whether it's going to a job or talking to my best friend or talking to a grandparent or talking to a room full of kindergarten kids. So we've moved on and talked about a number of people. I want to talk about some people that have actually operationalized some of this. One of those people was Fred Newman, a philosopher of science, and Lois Holtzman, a developmentalist, developmental psychologist. And together with Dr. Lenora Fulani, who developmental psychologist, they created a series of programs that operationalized this idea of creating developmental learning environments. So the Honors College builds on that tradition. And people have been doing this around the world. Another very dear colleague of mine, Dan Friedman, wrote a book recently called Performance Activism. And in that book, he talks about how people use performativity around the world and talked about the work in Kenya, in Brazil, in different parts of the United States. All over the world, people are trying to use performance, improvisation, and play in more intentional ways to support people's development and growth. A couple other people I want to mention is the important theater person named Viola Spolin, whose theater games have been instrumental in trying to create activities where people can kind of open up, if you will. So things like the concept of yes-anding, but playing like games like Zip, Zap, Zop, or the building on each other's words to create a story, like say the 3-word story game. There's a whole bunch of games that we can use to train ourselves to think about how we can build on what other people are doing. So yes and is something that we've embraced. It's a concept that comes out of theater, which is that people can offer something, but in order to receive it, you have to be paying attention. So first thing, pay attention to the people around you, right? And then you receive it and then you create off of it. So yes-anding. And a lot of people think, well, yes-anding just means you agree with everybody. Not necessarily. It means that you're building with what they're giving you. You actually might disagree with them, but you're building with it. So it's a creative activity. Something that Lois Holtzman said, she talked about how basically you can only create with what people give you, right? And so that's the idea. So there are many traditions. I mean, I think about, the work of Judith Butler in terms of performance of gender, the work of jazz musicians in terms of building off of each other, the work of people who are cooks, people who are caretakers. You're having to constantly build with what's around there. So they may not have written out some of these theories, but, people act out and perform this kind of work. So the Honors College is steeped in this idea of the importance of play, experimenting, and performing, because we see that all life's a stage, all the world's a stage, and that these are stages that we can create with other people so that people can grow, learn, and develop. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll see you around. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I just gave a lecture based on some rough ideas, and I just want to kind of go through and see and get the thing and see what happens. Yeah, thank you.